Imagine you have spent your entire life becoming the most important person in the room. Every room. You are 33 years old, and you have already achieved what most scholars spend a lifetime chasing. The greatest university in the Islamic world has placed you at its head. Hundreds of students crowd your lectures. Sultans want your opinion. Viziers quote your name in court. You are, by every measurable standard, at the absolute peak of your field. And then one morning you stand before your students, open your mouth to speak, and nothing comes out. Not stage fright, not a passing illness, nothing. Your voice simply fails you. Your body locks, and for days and then weeks you cannot eat, cannot lecture, cannot function as the man the world believes you to be. The doctors examine you and find nothing physically wrong, but you know the truth because you wrote it down later in one of the most searingly honest documents in Islamic intellectual history. You had looked at yourself clearly, perhaps for the first time, and what you saw was not the proof of Islam. What you saw was a man who had been worshipping his own reputation. This is the story of Al-Ghazali, and this episode is the story not of his rise, but of his collapse, and of what he built from the ruins of it. Welcome to Muslim Biographies, where we tell the real stories of the most remarkable figures in Islamic history. Not the simplified versions, not the hagiographies, but the full human picture. Contradictions, crises and all. If you are watching for the first time, we are glad you are here. Now here is something important to understand before we go any further. Al-Ghazali is one of those figures whose legacy is so immense that it is easy to flatten him into a symbol. Hujjat al-Islam, the proof of Islam, a title awarded to very few people in the history of this tradition. But symbols do not have nervous breakdowns. Symbols do not lie awake questioning whether their entire career has been an act of elaborate self-deception. Men do. And this episode is about the man. Before we go any further, if you are finding this story powerful, please take 5 seconds and hit the subscribe button. It costs you nothing, but it means everything to a small channel like this one. Every subscriber helps us reach more people who need to hear these stories. Abu Hamid Muhammad Al-Ghazali was born around 1058 in Tus, in the northeastern Persian region of Khorasan. His father, a wool spinner, died when Al-Ghazali was still a child, leaving him and his younger brother Ahmad in the care of a Sufi friend of the family. That guardian made sure the boys had the means to study. It was, in retrospect, one of the more consequential acts of generosity in the history of Islamic thought. Al-Ghazali was, from an early age, exceptionally gifted. He moved through the scholarly world with a kind of effortless acceleration that must have been both impressive and slightly unsettling to those around him. He studied Islamic law, theology, philosophy, and logic under some of the finest minds of the 11th century, most significantly under Imam al-Haramain al-Juwayni in Nishapur. When al-Juwayni died in 1085, Al-Ghazali was already well known. What came next was remarkable even by the standards of his remarkable life. He entered the court of Nizam al-Mulk, the legendary Seljuk vizier, who was at that point the most powerful political figure in the Sunni Muslim world. Nizam al-Mulk ran a network of institutions called the Nizamiyya madrasas. Think of them as the most prestigious academic infrastructure in the Islamic world of that era. And in 1091, he appointed Al-Ghazali to the most coveted position in that entire network, professor at the Nizamiyya of Baghdad. Baghdad in 1091 was not simply a capital city. It was the intellectual center of the world, and the Nizamiyya was its leading institution, drawing students from across the Islamic world and producing the scholars, jurists, and administrators who staffed the Seljuk state. Al-Ghazali was, at this point, approximately 300 students strong in his lecture hall. His legal opinions carried weight across the Sunni world. He was consulted on theological controversies. He was, in the fullest sense of the phrase, the man of the moment. But here is where it gets interesting, because behind the outward success, something was quietly unraveling. Al-Ghazali was, by his own account, deeply troubled during this period. The trouble was not external. It was not political pressure, not rival scholars, not the instability of the Seljuk court following the assassination of Nizam al-Mulk in 1092. Though all of those things were real enough, the trouble was internal, and it was more dangerous than any of the external pressures. He had begun to ask himself a question that, once asked, could not be unasked. Was he pursuing knowledge for the sake of Allah or for the sake of his own prestige? In his autobiographical work, Al-Munqidh min al-Dalal, Deliverance from Error, written years later, he describes this period with a directness that is almost shocking in its candor. He writes that when he examined his motives honestly, he found that his teaching was driven by the desire for fame and reputation rather than sincere devotion. He describes himself as standing on the edge of hellfire, not metaphorically. He means it, and that realization arriving at the height of his career broke something in him. The breakdown, when it came in 1095, was total. He could not speak, he could not eat normally. His body simply refused to cooperate with the life he was trying to maintain. His colleagues assumed it was illness. His students assumed it was exhaustion. Modern scholars who have studied the Munqidh in detail have described it as a psychosomatic crisis, the body articulating what the mind could no longer contain. Whatever we call it, the result was the same. The most prominent scholar in the Islamic world arranged support for his family, told his colleagues he was going on pilgrimage, and quietly disappeared from Baghdad. What Al-Ghazali did during those 11 years is one of the more extraordinary episodes in the history of Islamic thought. He would not return for 11 years. He travelled. He studied Sufism not as an academic subject, but as a lived practice. He spent time in Syria, in Jerusalem, in Mecca and Medina. He retreated, he wrote, and he thought, with the rigour of a trained philosopher and the urgency of a man who genuinely believed his soul was at stake about the question of how a human being is supposed to live. Now here is something important to understand about this period. Al-Ghazali had, before his breakdown, already written one of his most significant works, Tahafut al-Falasifa, the Incoherence of the Philosophers. In that text, written around 1095, he systematically dismantled the claims of Islamic Aristotelian philosophy, particularly the work of Ibn Sina and Al-Farabi, on 20 separate points. 3 of those points he declared outright heresy. The philosophers claimed that the world was eternal rather than created, their denial of bodily resurrection, and their argument that God only knows universals rather than particulars. It is a formidable piece of work, brilliantly argued, technically precise, and depending on your perspective, either a necessary corrective to philosophical overreach or a catastrophic blow to Islamic rationalism. The philosopher Ibn Rushd, whom we covered in an earlier episode, felt strongly enough about the latter view that he wrote an entire response, Tahafut al-Tahafut, the Incoherence of the Incoherence, defending the philosophers against Al-Ghazali's critique. That debate between the two greatest minds of their respective traditions rippled through Islamic intellectual history for centuries and reached European scholasticism by a different route. But it is fair to say that the incoherence of the philosophers, whatever its intellectual merits, contributed to a climate in which philosophical inquiry in the Eastern Islamic world became increasingly difficult to defend. That is a charge that historians continue to debate, and one that this channel takes seriously, because Al-Ghazali was not simply a conservative reacting against modernity, he was himself a trained philosopher who used philosophical methods to critique philosophy. The picture is genuinely complicated. Leading on from this, what Al-Ghazali produced during and after his years of wandering was something of a different order entirely. The Ihya Ulum al-Din, the revival of the religious sciences, is by most measures his masterwork. It is a vast encyclopedic text in 4 parts, covering acts of worship, social conduct, the vices that destroy the soul, and the virtues that save it. What makes it remarkable is not simply its scope, but its integration. Al-Ghazali weaves together Islamic law, theology, ethics, and Sufi spiritual practice into a single coherent framework. He is not arguing that the inner life replaces the outward law. He is arguing that without the inner life, the outward law is empty performance, prayer without presence of heart, charity without sincerity, knowledge without fear of God. All of it, he argues, meaningless. The revival of the religious sciences became, and arguably remains, the most widely read work in the Muslim world after the Quran itself. That is not an exaggeration. It is not a niche scholarly text. It shaped how ordinary Muslims understood the relationship between their daily practice and their inner life, across centuries and across continents. Al-Ghazali eventually returned to teaching, briefly, at Nishapur around 1106, before withdrawing again to his hometown of Tus, where he established a small school and a Sufi lodge and spent his remaining years teaching and writing in a register very different from his Baghdad years. He died in December 1111 at around 53 years of age, reportedly with the composure of a man who had made his peace. And all in all, what do we make of him? Al-Ghazali is one of those figures where the legacy genuinely cannot be reduced to a verdict. He was a man of stunning intellectual power who turned that power toward a question most scholars of his era were not asking: what is knowledge actually for? His answer, that knowledge is only meaningful when it leads toward God and toward sincerity, is either the most important corrective in Islamic intellectual history or a factor in the narrowing of Islamic philosophical culture, depending on where you stand. What is not in question is the courage of the man. It is one thing to have a crisis of conscience in private. It is another to have one publicly, in the most watched position in your entire civilization, and to walk away from it rather than simply continue performing. Al-Ghazali could have kept lecturing. He chose not to, and the book he wrote from the other side of that choice, the one about reviving what had been lost rather than defending what had been built, is still being read today. That is not nothing. That is, by almost any measure, everything. If this episode gave you something to think about, please subscribe to Muslim Biographies and share it with someone who would appreciate it. Turn on notifications so you never miss an episode. We cover the figures who shaped this tradition in all their complexity, and there are many more stories still to tell. We will see you in the next one.